Welcome to episode 150 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and the personal case reviews of my former colleagues who served in the FBI. Today, we get to speak to Bill Plunkett, who served in the FBI for 27 years. During his FBI career, he worked joint counterintelligence operations with the CIA and investigated national security and cybercrime matters. In this episode, Bill reviews the 1929 Bureau of Investigations case featuring the mysterious death of Virginia McPherson, an attractive young nurse found semi-nude in her apartment with a pajama cord wrapped around her neck. The case was initially investigated by the Washington D.C. Metropolitan Police, but after a public outcry when Virginia's death was ruled a suicide, FBI Director Hoover's G-men were asked to step in and redo the investigation. During his FBI career, Bill Plunkett was assigned to the Albany Division, the Cincinnati Division, and the Washington Field Office in D.C. He was an original member of the Cincinnati FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, formed immediately after 9/11. Bill Plunkett is the author of 2 true crime books that take place in the early days of the FBI, which was known initially as the Bureau of Investigation. In The G-Man and the Nurse, his second book, Bill recounts the story of the Virginia McPherson case. Bill's book is part of my FBI reading resource, books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have appeared on this podcast. To get your copy of this colorful book list, all you need to do is join my reader team. You can do so at my website, jerrywilliams.com, and that's Jerri Williams.com. Or if you're listening to this on a podcast app, there's a link in the description of this episode. One quick thing before we get to the interview. I want to remind you that you have until January 31st to get in your questions for our episode next month with a special agent recruiter from the Philadelphia Division. She'll be answering all of your questions about what it takes to join the FBI. Listen to my first episode with Philadelphia recruiters, which was episode 41. After you listen to that, if you have additional questions, then email them to me at jerrywilliamsauthor@gmail.com, and please put FBI Q&A in the subject line. And now, here's the show. I am excited to introduce my guest, Bill Plunkett. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Very good. Thank you.
I have been reading a lot about the origins of the Bureau, and this is one of those cases that occurred in the very, very early days of the FBI. I'm very interested in why you decided to write a book, or write 2 books, as a matter of fact, about these early cases.
Well, how the first story began when I got the idea to write a book, The G-Man and the Diamond King, which is the first case. How I got interested in it initially was because a friend of mine who was an agent out of the Covington office saw an article in the Kentucky Post about an FBI agent that had been killed in the line of duty back in 1935. And his name was Nelson Klein, and no one in the Cincinnati office knew about it. He was assigned to the Cincinnati office at the time. He put it aside until he retired from the FBI, and he went to the gravesite and found that the agent, Nelson Klein's gravesite, was in disrepair. He contacted the family, the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI, and the local Cincinnati Police Museum, raised the money to fix the gravesite, added an FBI badge to the family monument and Klein's name and the date that he was killed in the shootout in West College Corner. So after we did all that, I was involved in it. I wanted to know more about the case. So that's what happened. I looked into it, and that's how we got the G-Man and the Diamond King.
So initially, you didn't start looking into this with the idea that you were going to write a book.
No, I just wanted to find out what happened. And then I thought this would make a screenplay because of what happened. And so instead of that, I decided on a book. One of the local bookstores gave me the name of 3 local publishers. And I went to the publisher is in Wilmington, Ohio, about an hour away from here. And that kicked it off. So that's how we got the G-Man and the Diamond King. The case involves Klein and McGovern, 2 FBI agents assigned to the Cincinnati office in 1935 who were investigating a criminal for car theft. The subject, George W. Barrett, a previous moonshiner who had killed his mother and sister, had graduated to car theft. Barrett was wanted on a local warrant out of San Diego, California, for car theft, and the agents received information that Barrett was visiting his brother, John Barrett, in the sleepy little town of West College Corner, Indiana, just across the Ohio border. The agents went to West College Corner and they set up surveillance on Barrett's car, the car thief. And Barrett came back to the car. The agents pulled their car up and to keep him from leaving. And they didn't realize that he was carrying a towel. And in that towel was wrapped a .45 caliber Bisley model single action revolver loaded with 5 bullets. So Agent Klein exited his vehicle, yelled to Barrett, "We are federal officers." Barrett ran down an alley and pulled his revolver. Klein drew his Colt .38 super automatic, and the gunfight lasted all of a few minutes. Agent Klein was hit by 5 bullets from Barrett's weapon. Klein fired 9 shots from his automatic, and McGovern, his partner, also fired his weapon, a Colt .38 police positive revolver. Agent Klein died at the scene and was transported to Christ Hospital in Cincinnati for an autopsy. And Barrett was hit in both knees and transported to Fort Hamilton Hospital, Hamilton, Ohio, and he recovered.
And the case that we're going to talk about today, the G-Man and the nurse, what made you decide to look into that case?
So doing the research on the first book, I obtained Agent Klein's FBI personnel file. And while conducting review, I found a 1929 letter of commendation to Klein from Director Hoover for the Washington D.C. murder investigation of Mary Virginia Hurley McPherson. She goes by Virginia McPherson. Klein, along with 11 other agents from various FBI offices, were pulled together to work out of the Washington field office to investigate her death. The case is mentioned in the first book, and I decided to take a more in-depth look. So the idea for the G-Man and the Nurse began when I was finishing up my first book, The G-Man and the Diamond King.
Before we start talking about the G-Man and the nurse, I just want to go a little bit deeper on your interest in Klein in the first place. And you had mentioned that the office was not aware of his line of duty death?
Well, nationally, of course, every year, we have the memorial services and the names are read. So from a national standpoint, he was known, but he was not known in the office here. We added an FBI badge and an inscription, Nelson B. Klein, Special Agent, FBI, killed in the line of duty, August 16th, 1935. A few years later, the Society of Former Special Agents provided the funds, and we put a plaque up in the FBI office honoring Agent Klein. We had approximately 100 or so law enforcement guests and individuals from the local FBI office. There were some family members present. His son couldn't make it, who's still alive and lives in Florida, but 2 of his granddaughters were there to take part in the ceremony. And then as recently as August of 2017, we dedicated an Indiana historical marker over in West College Corner, Indiana, about 100 feet from where the shooting took place. He's remembered in Kentucky, where he's buried. He's remembered now in the Cincinnati FBI office, and now in Indiana as well, where the shooting took place.
Wow. And before you learned about this, had you thought about writing a book?
No. I had spent, almost 30 years affiliated with the FBI. I struggled with the paperwork. I had no thoughts of ever writing anything. But once I got into it, it's the challenge.
Wow, that's really amazing to me, because I've spoken to a lot of agents. Matter of fact, there's over 45 of agents who I've interviewed who have actually written a book, and all of them had, like myself, a desire all along to write a book and was just looking for the subject matter to get us started. And you're just the opposite. You found the subject matter, it started to interest you, and then you thought, well, maybe I'll write a book.
Exactly. I don't know if I knew what I was getting myself into the first time. I don't know where it would have gone. The other thing is, these are cases. So what I enjoyed about the FBI was working the case. That's what these are. So that's where the interest, the challenge comes from.
All right, so we've heard a little bit about your first book, and again, that was The G-Man and the Diamond King.
Right.
So why don't we start talking about your second book, which is The G-Man and the Nurse.
Virginia Hurley was from China Grove, North Carolina, and had moved to Washington, D.C. for schooling and training as a nurse. She met Robert McPherson Jr., a bank clerk, an amateur football player, and they were married in 1928. The marriage was rocky, and they argued about money, former lovers. He hit her on some occasions, and a few days before her death, they had separated. Virginia's body was found on Saturday, September 14th, 1929, by her husband, semi-nude with a pajama cord around her neck. It was estimated that she had been dead for at least a day or more. The Washington Metropolitan Police investigated the case. Lieutenant Edward J. Kelly of the Detective Bureau led the investigation, and he had an open mind as to whether the death was murder or suicide. McPherson provided a timeline of his activity prior to his wife's death to the police at the couple's apartment and then later at his parents' residence. No written statement by McPherson was taken, which would later come back to haunt the Metropolitan Police Department as they were being criticized that the investigation was botched because of this and because of unprofessional collection of evidence and lack of interviews. The autopsy and coroner's inquest ruled a suicide. The doctors who performed the autopsy determined it was suicide, but Lieutenant Kelly suggested that the police should continue the investigation before they officially declared it such.
So how did she die?
She was strangled.
But they're saying that she strangled herself?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there's two sides. Some are saying murder, some are saying suicide.
Now, you said she had a pajama cord wrapped around her neck.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious as to what made them think that it was suicide.
She had attempted suicide a number of times before.
Okay.
So in gathering the information about the case, there were destroyed, missing, or redacted records. The Metropolitan Police report contained in the FBI file was only 8 pages, with 1 page redacted. The autopsy report completed by the Washington, D.C. coroner's office on September 14th, 1929, could not be located. The Washington, D.C. archives and D.C. medical examiner's office, I contacted both of them, and they had no copy of the autopsy, and they mentioned that they're only kept for 65 years, nor did they have a copy of the transcript of the coroner's inquest. There was a transcript of the coroner's inquest in the FBI file listed as Exhibit Number 7, but at some point, years later, it was destroyed. So grand jury material, since grand jury material is secret and most of the FBI interviews were not in the FBI investigative file as they had been redacted, facts about the case had to be pieced together with other documents in the FBI file and hundreds of newspaper articles. One of the newspaper articles dated September 15th, 1929 from the Washington Post said it all. Police baffled by case of carotid young wife. The U.S. National Archives and Records Administration, I contacted them to try to get the grand jury file, and they advised that it was charged out to a clearinghouse in 1952 prior to being shipped to the archives. They didn't know who had custody of the file. And then I checked with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, and they advised that grand jury material release is prohibited by law. So it all had to be pieced together. I guess you can only say a rogue patrolman, Robert Joseph Allen, who had been on the Metropolitan Police Force for less than 3 years, wasn't at the initial crime scene, but he didn't believe the coroner's jury that it was suicide, and he began his own unofficial investigation. He stated that the PD were predisposed to suicide, suggested evidence was destroyed, interviewed witnesses on his own, went to the crime scene a few days later, and generally made a nuisance of himself Some of the half dozen or so Washington newspapers got on the bandwagon, as did the public, who wanted a different verdict than suicide. Allen, who had been through a number of police trial boards for previous infractions, would later face one for his meddling with the McPherson case. The newspapers suggested there were 5 suspects who may have murdered Virginia. The first was her husband. He was at the top of the list of suspects. The second was Dr. Thomas A. Ballard, a former boyfriend of Virginia who had moved to New York City around the time the McPhersons were married. He was interviewed by the Bureau of Investigation. He denied ever being engaged or in love with Virginia, and he gave his opinion that she was murdered. The Bureau of Investigation checked his alibi, and it was sound. The other suspect, Howard Templeton, he had attended high school at China Grove, North Carolina with Virginia and had just moved to Washington, D.C., was another suspect. Coincidentally, he obtained a position at the Park Lane Pharmacy where Virginia lived and made a store delivery of 2 packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes on Thursday evening. Thus, he was the last person to see her alive. Another person of interest was a football buddy of McPherson's, Robert Lyons Jr., who was considered by some to be uncouth and a roughneck. And finally, some even suggested that Patrolman Allen, who had started his own investigation, did that to steer scrutiny away from himself, that maybe he was involved in her murder. After all the investigation, it was her husband, McPherson, who was on the hot seat with the press and public and the justice system.
So what about her family? Did they think she committed suicide, or were they also pushing for further investigation?
Her family, senators from North and South Carolina, and the public were all pushing for that it was murder. The family specifically said that it wasn't suicide, that someone had killed her.
Dr. Ballard also suspected that she had been murdered. Do you know why he thought that?
I think just because he knew her, he didn't think she would do that. I don't remember any specific why he said that.
On her other suicide attempts, how did she go about those attempts?
A couple of them were turning on the gas in the apartments. Another time, a friend had said she went up to the roof of the building and had planned to jump off. Another time, her husband had said that she had taken morphine to kill herself. So there were a number of different types of attempts.
Reported?
Yes, there were 2 that had been reported to the police.
Okay. All right. But it does seem strange that somebody would commit suicide by strangling themselves. I can't even imagine how you do that.
It's a surgical knot, and she knew how to tie a surgical knot being a nurse. At one point, she was visiting her parents in the Carolinas, and her husband was with her, and her mother wanted her to go to the store for her. And she said, yeah, just as soon as I finish showing my husband, Bob, how to tie a surgical knot. So we add the possibility that the husband knew how to tie a surgical knot as well as she did.
And we also know that he was interested in learning how to do that. It's kind of odd.
Right, exactly. It's another oddity in the whole case where you can look at one side and say it's suicide, and the other side, there's all the points that say murder. It's very interesting. So the newspapers were heavily involved in it, and they were asking questions. Why were there 2 knots in the pajama belt that was around her neck? If she killed herself, wouldn't the knot be in the front? If done by a killer, wouldn't the knot be in the back? Wouldn't someone who strangled themselves sit down or lie down while performing the act? And then the other question they were asking, would a woman strangle themselves during cleanup of her period or with the lights out? I don't know that any of these were ever answered. So those that thought it was suicide, they pointed to no evidence of a struggle. Blood in the bathroom was from her period. The pajama cord was tied with a surgical knot, which Virginia knew how to tie. The investigation didn't identify someone fleeing the scene. And Virginia had attempted suicide before, anywhere from 3 to 6 times. Those that thought it was murder, they were saying that the blood in the bathroom indicates she was murdered in the bathroom and then carried to the bedroom. The janitor and others heard screams coming from the floor where the McPhersons resided. Doctors testified that it was almost impossible for someone to strangle themselves in this way, and that someone heard someone running from the scene in a loud car leaving nearby.
With all of that information, was there a theory as to why the initial police report said suicide or the coroner's report said suicide?
The patrolman Allen just thought that the homicide squad or the detective squad was lazy, and that when they had the coroner's inquest, there were something like 30 witnesses and only a handful testified. So 6 days after the coroner's jury, on September 23rd, Allen was suspended by the police department for attempting to arrest McPherson. Allen wanted McPherson to answer more questions at the station, and McPherson wouldn't comply. But McPherson eventually went voluntarily, whereby they almost came to fisticuffs at the police department. Allen also, he didn't previously tell his superiors that he had a witness in the case who saw someone exit from the McPherson apartment window at the back of the roof around the time of Virginia's death. So he was also suspended for withholding evidence.
So why was he so fascinated with this? This Allen guy is just a patrolman who wasn't even at the scene when her body was found, but he is just adamant that they do more and that the investigation continue and that the husband be considered a suspect. Why?
He didn't think, one, that a woman would kill herself this way, leaving the lower half of her body unclothed. That was one. Second, he didn't think a woman was strong enough to strangle themselves in the way that it happened. He created plenty of doubt as to whether it was suicide. Politicians like North Carolina Senator Lee Slater Overman, the Hurley family, and the newspapers would get involved, culminating with the case being brought before a federal grand jury, hearing 70 witnesses. Allen would testify before the grand jury that he felt it was murder, as no one could strangle themselves in the way Virginia did. He even tried his own experiment and paid a few women to try to reenact the strangling. They couldn't do it. Lieutenant Kelly would testify before the grand jury that based on his investigation, he felt Virginia had committed suicide. Mrs. Roy Haverin, who lived just below the McPherson apartment, would testify that she had heard a woman cry out from the McPherson apartment on the night in question. Others who lived in the adjoining building would also testify of hearing screams, cries, and moaning, but it couldn't be pinned down to the McPherson apartment. Garnet Melvin Fry, a cab driver, would testify that he had taken McPherson in his cab from a location a block from the White House to the Park Lane apartments around 1:30 to 3 a.m. near the time of Virginia's death. Assistant U.S. Attorney William Collins would lead the review before the grand jury, with testimony lasting less than a week. McPherson was indicted for first-degree murder by a vote of 13-10.
And do we have Patrolman Allen to thank for this turn of events?
Yes, I think that he stirred up enough interest with the public, the newspapers, and the senators, which is what caused them to have a grand jury. Once McPherson was indicted for the murder of his wife, he was held at the Washington D.C. jail. He would spend over 6 weeks at the facility while the FBI would come in and take another look at the case.
Now, how did that happen? You know, we all knew that at some point the FBI was going to come in because this is about FBI case reviews. But I don't understand, first of all, if you could explain, it's a murder case. And, you know, the FBI really does not, especially back in those days, have a jurisdiction for murder. So how did the FBI become involved in this particular case and in a murder case in general?
Well, because of the results of the grand jury where they filed a report criticizing the police handling of the investigation, specifically Inspector Shelby and Lieutenant Kelly, and they ended up being moved to lesser duties, having no supervisory responsibility, and some were calling for their firing. They brought in the Justice Department, a special prosecutor. The Attorney General made that decision to handle the case, to take another look at it, because the grand jury said that they didn't feel that the case was worked appropriately. So the Bureau of Investigation, precursor of the FBI, was brought in to take a second look at the case, which was already weeks old, and the crime scene had been dismantled. The Bureau would bring in a dozen agents from around the country to conduct the investigation out of the Washington field office. The matter was headed by Inspector Thomas F. Cullen and Chicago SAC Earl J. Conley, and closely watched by Director J. Edgar Hoover. One of the agents that worked on the case was Oscar George Hall. He was assigned to the Columbus office at the time and detailed in the McPherson case. He was involved in some of the higher profile cases of the day, of public enemy number ones, Babyface Nelson, a prolific bank robber, Alvin Old Creepy Carpus, and Thomas Henry Robinson Jr., who were subjects of major kidnapping cases in 1934. Another agent was John Lawrence Hickey. He was assigned to the Washington field office at the time, designated to this case. He served in the Bureau of Investigation from 1927 to 31 in offices in Nashville, New York City, and El Paso. He was a graduate of Georgetown University Foreign Service School in 1925. He later was employed as an executive with the U.S. Civil Service Commission. On October 5th, Allen was reinstated by the Commissioner of Police off of suspension, and the commissioner wanted to pass him over to Prosecutor Lasky to assist with the Bureau of Investigation's efforts in the case. Lasky politely declined the help, and Allen would still go before a police trial board on November 9th to face charges. The newspapers of the day, especially the Washington Times, would do editorials, and they weren't concerned about McPherson being charged, only that someone was held accountable in what they thought was a murder. They were advocating murder and worked with the McPherson family, and they were the ones that helped find the taxi cab driver, one of the so-called eyewitnesses, and supported Allen's unofficial investigation. They were more concerned that the homicide squad not botch another similar future murder case of this type. So while the Bureau of Investigation was conducting their review of the case, a second autopsy was ordered. Virginia was buried at a cemetery in China Grove, North Carolina. Her parents had to give written permission to have the Bureau of Investigation disinter the body. The body was taken to Kannapolis, North Carolina for the autopsy, which was led by Dr. James Bullitt from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The result was, like all other parts of the investigation, sort of inconclusive. But all the doctors involved felt it was possible Virginia could have killed herself in the manner she did, but unlikely.
And did they further explain that?
Well, they just thought that in order to kill yourself in that manner, you'd probably need more strength when tying the rope cord belt around your neck. But my feeling is that once one of the doctors said that more than likely she didn't kill her this way, they all went along with it.
Okay, so it was possible, but not probable.
Right.
So what did the FBI agents do that was different than what the Metropolitan Police had during their investigation?
They just did a whole lot more interviews. They interviewed all the neighbors near McPherson's parents' house, all the neighborhood there. They interviewed all the residents of the apartment at the Park Lane Apartments where the couple lived. They interviewed everyone that lived in the apartments next door. They contacted all the taxi cab companies and interviewed all the drivers, which is how they came up with the one taxi cab driver, although it was through the Washington Times that found him. But they interviewed a lot of the taxi cab drivers. They also interviewed the streetcar operators, around all this around the time that they think that she died. And of course, they did the second autopsy as well.
I'm just wondering what the relationship was with the Bureau and the Metropolitan Police in Washington, D.C., to see the FBI coming behind them and redoing their investigation. Was that an issue?
I remember a statement by Director Hoover saying, "We're not here to look over the Metropolitan Police's shoulder. We're just coming in to see if we can find something else that maybe they had missed." And the relationship, I know that Agent Klein, he did some of his interviews with one of the detectives early on. So I think they were probably happy to pass it along because they were getting so much heat about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you could explain why a murder case, was this something that was under the Bureau's jurisdiction nationwide during this time?
No, it was because Washington, D.C. was a government reservation back then. The FBI wouldn't normally investigate a murder case, but because of what happened with the grand jury, them filing this second report, which I don't know that it was ever done before, maybe it's been done since, where they just criticized the police investigation. And so with the public's uproar and the senators, it pushed the attorney general that he had to do something.
So if this had occurred, say, in Maryland or Virginia, then the Bureau would not have been able to investigate it or reinvestigate it.
I wouldn't think so, but back then, I guess, who knows, right? If the president says he wants something investigated, I guess they would do it. That's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that. So the first grand jury gets nullified. McPherson's indictment was invalidated by the prosecutor when it was determined that one of the jurors was receiving a federal pension of $40 a month. And the prosecutor was proactive. Instead of having the defense attorney file a motion, he just decided that, hey, it would be better to just resubmit the case to the current sitting grand jury, a different grand jury. And he felt that he had a better case than they did for the first grand jury because they had the new streetcar operator that was a supposed eyewitness that McPherson was on his streetcar the evening of his wife's death. During that time, McPherson could have been released from jail, but for some reason his attorney decided against it. So the Bureau of Investigation, they interviewed 800 witnesses, which amounted to 4 million words put down on Bureau of Investigation reports. Their investigation took them to Maryland, Virginia, New York, and the Carolinas. They would complete a summary report of 32 pages outlining their investigative efforts. And at the time the report came out, Hoover kept it locked in his safe. 4 days after the first indictment was thrown out, a different second grand jury began hearing testimony. Prosecutor John Lasky thought he had a stronger case than the first grand jury. Defense attorney William Leahy thought all the evidence against McPherson was circumstantial. The jury would hear from 104 witnesses. Allen told his story again, which most had heard a few times before because the press had reported it. And some witnesses contradicted their previous testimony. A dozen of McPherson's friends and family were his timeline alibi. Streetcar conductor Joseph Lewick was contacted by the Bureau of Investigation and reluctantly came forward with information that McPherson had entered his streetcar on the evening of September 12th, which cast doubt on McPherson's alibi. Combining taxicab driver Garnet Melvin Fry's information and Lewick's at least gave the prosecution the possibility of a second indictment. Unfortunately, both Fry and Lewick would be seen as less than credible by the second grand jury. Again, the newspapers played a large role in the case. There were rumors of infidelity by Virginia with Dr. Ballard, the official police report of an incident of attempted suicide. There was a report of $1,000 missing from the couple's bank account. They actually only had $100 in the account. McPherson being abusive and taking Virginia's money to purchase alcohol, and a report that she was being blackmailed to provide illicit drugs to an unknown source.
So this is all new information that wasn't known during the first grand jury.
Yes, and I think that a lot of that was exaggeration to sell newspapers. So the second grand jury, there was no indictment. This time there were over 100 witnesses heard. Again, the prosecutor thought he had a stronger case, and the defense attorney thought it was all circumstantial. After 10 days, the second grand jury failed to indict McPherson by a vote of 19-4.
Now, that's kind of strange because you had mentioned that it was the prosecutor who decided to throw out the first indictment. Sounds like he should have kept it.
Like I said, he was trying to be preemptive because he knew the defense would bring it up, and they probably would have got thrown out anyway. McPherson was released after serving 6 weeks and 3 days at the D.C. jail. But the case wasn't over because we still have Inspector William Shelby and Lieutenant Edward James Kelly of the Detective Bureau. They had to face charges before the police trial board for a number of things: inadequate investigation, no written statement from McPherson and other witnesses, improper handling of evidence, misleading the grand jury witnesses, with Shelby suggesting 2 witnesses should be indicted for perjury. So over 100 witnesses were testified over 11 days during this trial board. Allen himself, he refused to testify as he thought it was a whitewash. And as it turned out, it was a whitewash because on January 6, 1930, Shelby and Kelly were acquitted of all charges.
So how did Hoover look at this case? They came in and they did the investigation over. They interviewed many, many more people. They came up with witnesses who were able to put McPherson at the scene, but there was no indictment. Did Hoover look at this as a failure on the Bureau's part?
No. I found one interview of him in one of the newspapers, and he commented that all the investigation they had done to that point didn't point to suicide, pointed to murder. But I think the agents were commended by the second grand jury for the job that they did. So Hoover was happy that they won because the Bureau of Investigation looked really good, even though there wasn't a second indictment.
And so the work that the agents did, it wasn't enough to indict McPherson, but you had given us a list of other suspects. Doesn't sound like it pointed to anybody else, just that they still believe that she did not commit suicide.
Right. They looked, and the Bureau of Investigation looked at those other subjects. They went to New York and interviewed all the people where Dr. Ballard worked. They went to the Carolinas and interviewed people that knew Templeton, who had gone to high school with Virginia. As far as the other 2, one was Allen. I think the Bureau did look at him because his fingerprint card was in the file, and they interviewed him. As far as McPherson's other friend, I didn't see an interview in the file of him. I think they ruled him out because he was one of the alibi witnesses, along with other people, a group of people that were with McPherson around the time that his wife was killed.
I think one of the most interesting things about this is, with you being, an FBI agent, did you find any interesting comparisons or differences between how the FBI investigates cases today and how they investigated this case back in 1929?
Not really. I was surprised that they obtained all the telephone records from the Park Lane apartments and obtained the subscribers where they could. One of the subscribers happened to be a bootlegger where they got their alcohol from. They did a financial workup of their bank accounts, the couple's bank accounts. It didn't really show much. It showed that they didn't have a whole lot of money. And the reports were pretty much the same as they were during my time, the interview reports, the summaries, listing of all the exhibits that they were going to use in the case for the grand jury. No, I was surprised. I thought they did a really thorough job. They would even, at one point, they were taking a taxi cab from the apartment to where McPherson's parents lived to see how long that took, because I don't know whether they just wanted to know, because McPherson's mother had met with Virginia on the last evening of her life earlier in the day, like 5:00. So they did a lot of interesting investigation in the case.
Well, normally when I invite an agent to do a case review on FBI Retired Case File Review, it's his case. But of course, today we had to make an exception because this case happened in 1929. So on behalf of Agent Klein, who is now a service martyr with the FBI. I want to thank you for taking the time to research, in a way, investigate this case. I'm sure the family is appreciative of what you did in bringing Agent Klein's work on this matter and on the Diamond King case. Have you heard from them about the books?
Yes, the first one, of course. I was in contact with his son down in Florida, and a nephew as well, and his granddaughter. And yes, I kept them informed when we had the Indiana historical marker placed near the location where the shootout took place. The second book, no, and I think I did pass the information along to them, but I haven't heard from anybody from the Klein family.
Now, is this something that you're going to continue to do? Are you still looking for old, cold cases that you're going to research and turn into books?
Well, this is kind of a finishing, in the first book, it's only 2 pages, this case, the murder investigation. I keep saying murder, but I thought, as soon as I read the FBI summary of the case that SAC Conley had written, I knew it was suicide. It's like, wow, this is suicide. She killed herself. But anyway, to answer your question.
Wait a minute. You got to go back. So even after all of the points that have been brought up, and even after the physicians have looked at this case, you believe it's suicide instead of murder?
Yes, because she tried suicide before a number of times. Her husband said that it was her hobby to try and commit suicide. There was no sign of assault or forced entry to the apartment. She knew how to tie a surgical knot. She hung up on her mother-in-law during a telephone conversation they had the last night she was alive, and said she was going away and that she didn't need any money, that she had money. Well, she didn't have any money because there wasn't very little in the bank account. So, and then you have to look at motive. What's the motive for the husband? There's no money. There's no material items of any real value. There was no finding in either the police or FBI investigation that he had a girlfriend. And as far as like being rid of his wife, they had already separated. She was gone for all practical purposes. So, and again, I read the report, and it right off the bat, they mention all the attempts that she made to kill herself.
In the FBI report, was there a final conclusion?
No, they didn't really make any conclusions in the final report. And then Virginia's father wrote a letter to the president, and it got passed down to the president's secretary, to the attorney general, to Hoover, and then to Cullen, who was the inspector that oversaw the case. And he wrote a summary of the case and everything they did, and really didn't give an opinion one way or another. He might have suggested that there was very little to show that it was murder.
Oh, this has been fascinating. So the book again is The G-Men and the Nurse, a 1929 FBI Washington cold case. So, Bill, we've talked a lot about this case, and you had mentioned that you were in the Cincinnati Division. Before we end our conversation, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you, when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
I joined the FBI in 1982. My father worked for the Treasury Department, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and his office was right next to the FBI office in Syracuse, New York. I had already graduated from college, and he brought the application home, filled it out, and I started in the Albany office as a clerk, went to school nights. I didn't have an accounting background or anything like that, but I went to school nights taking accounting, and I got an accounting technician's position in the Syracuse RA out of the Albany office. And I was there for about a year and took the agent's exam and had my interview in Boston and went to Quantico. And my first office was Cincinnati. My second office was Washington, D.C. And I decided to come back to Cincinnati because I liked it here.
Great. And what did you work in Cincinnati?
In Cincinnati, I worked some foreign counterintelligence, and I was on the Joint Terrorism Task Force Working Group prior to 9/11 and became a full-fledged Joint Terrorism Task Force after 9/11. And then about 2.5, 3 years retired, I became the cyber supervisor.
Do you have any thoughts about writing a book about any of your own cases?
When I wrote the first book, there wasn't a whole lot of information about Klein. So I put in information about this particular case, about Virginia McPherson, a kidnapping case of a Labatt who owned Labatt Brewery in Canada. Klein worked a little bit on that. And he also worked on a kidnapping case in 1934 in Louisville. And that's the case that I'm working on right now. What happened in this particular case, about the nurse, I was waiting on the FBI on some photographs, and they didn't come. And finally, I put this aside and started working on a third project. So I'm about 3/4 of the way done with a first draft on a possible third book about that kidnapping in Louisville. As far as my own cases, I've thought about it. I recently had a radio interview. The person that was interviewing me asked me about that. And I said, well, a lot of the cases I worked on were little fires that you had to put out on the task force. So I don't have what I would call a significant major case that might be of interest. I think if I had kept a journal, I probably could have come up with some maybe historical fiction type thing. But right now, that doesn't really interest me. I'm going to finish the third project, and then we'll see if it's going to be a book or not. I don't know.
All right. So, Bill, one of the things I like to do at the end of each interview is to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about both of these cases. My first book, The G-Man and the Diamond King, and the second book, The G-Man and the Nurse. It's much appreciated. I hope those that decide to look into it further enjoy the read.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Bill, a photo of Virginia McPherson, and all the other players in this investigation. There's a link to a couple of newspaper articles about this case, and of course, I've included an image of Bill Plunkett's book, The G-Men and the Nurse, and a direct link to where you can purchase it. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. On my website, you'll find a post about how to listen to a podcast that you can send them. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. I don't have a crime fiction recommendation for you today. I'm finding it hard to keep up with my reading for pleasure. I am knee-deep in finishing up my next book, FBI in Film and Fiction, a manual for armchair detectives. You can get a preview peek of what the book will look like if you check out my weekly review blog of the new CBS show FBI, where I go over the cliches and misconceptions and creative license used in each episode. And stay tuned for more information about when you'll be able to pick up a copy of my first nonfiction book, FBI in Film and Fiction, a manual for armchair detectives, coming soon to all stores where books are sold. Thank you for listening to the very end. If you want to support FBI Retired Case File Review, I hope you'll consider picking up a copy of one of my books in my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. The crime fiction series features Special Agent Carrie Wheeler, Temptation, Corruption, and Redemption. The books are available as ebooks and paperbacks at Amazon.com, and Pay to Play is also an audiobook. I want to thank you for listening. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.